Hey everyone! So this video we're going to go over the drama introduction and then some differences with British drama, and then I'll have 3 short videos on Oedipus, Trifles, and Midsummer Night's Dream to go over those to help you to study for the final exam. I'll also put up a review for the final exam, and the final exam is not comprehensive. It is just on the drama module on those 3 plays, plus the information from what drama is and the differences with British Renaissance drama. So there are different elements of drama, just like with short stories and poetry. The first one being the situation. Where are we and what is going on? And it explains the background and premise, like the exposition of a story. So the setting, just like before, we're going to look at the historical setting, when the play occurs, the geographical setting, where on Earth, if on Earth the play occurs, and the physical setting, in what particular room or location the play occurs. So thinking about Oedipus, historical, ancient Greece, geographical in Greece in a specific city. The physical setting, it takes place outside of the courthouse, the palace, um, throughout the entire play. Then we'll look at things like Midsummer Night's Dream, where it's still ancient Greece in Athens, but the physical setting goes from the palace to different places in the woods back to the palace. You can see how it changes depending on the type of play. The conflict is going to be the central problem or impediment facing the protagonist. What is he or she fighting against, hoping for, or losing out to? Basically, the conflict is the action that drives the play. And the context is the situation between the characters and the history they share. A lot of times, unless it's something like Oedipus, where the history they share is part of the mystery, um, we'll at least get the basic information that you're supposed to have for the play to understand how the characters work. So in Oedipus, we understand that Oedipus is the king, Jocasta is the queen, his wife, um, Tiresias is the blind prophet. Same thing, Midsummer Night's Dream. We start to understand who the characters are. Same thing with Trifles. And we all get that in the very beginning of the play, so we kind of understand where are we, what's going on, who all is involved. Next, we focus on the character. Who are the people that we've just been introduced to? So, same as with short stories, we're going to have our protagonist, our main character who faces the problem of the conflict. The antagonist is the character or force working against the protagonist. And then the foils are the secondary characters who help us develop the story and tell us more about the protagonist. Then we want to focus on the words and action, especially when you're reading a play, you don't get to see everything going on, but it's even when you are seeing what's going on, you can't pay attention to every little detail that's going on in the stage. So you have to listen to understand what's going on as well. Words and action describe how the play's ideas are going to be revealed to us. With words, that's the majority of a play. We don't get descriptions of what the characters are doing as much with a play, especially in written format, because they're meant to be viewed. Uh, but to read them, you have dialogues, which are conversations between 2 or more characters. Monologues are words spoken by a single character when other characters are on the stage. So, think about our poem that was a dramatic monologue, My Last Duchess. We know there was another character there because the Duke addresses the character, but the other character never speaks. That's a monologue. A soliloquy is a moment when a character is alone on stage and they're technically addressing the audience with their speech. They're not breaking the fourth wall most of the time. They're still kind of talking to themselves, but it's as if they're addressing the audience. Most famous of this is Hamlet's to be or not to be speech. Asides are going to be side remarks that characters make that are meant only for the audience, not the others in the scene. These ones do break the fourth wall because they're, making these asides, and it's not just, oh, a thought they have in their head that they're vocalizing for the benefit of the audience. It's them actually addressing the audience in this case. Now, for action, we do get stage business or the behavior the actors are instructed to perform. If you're watching a play, you can see it. If you're reading a play, sometimes you'll get stage directions written in the text that you can tell what they're supposed to be doing. Props are used, items to be held are used by the characters. Again, this is more beneficial when you watch a play than when you read the play. And same with effects, lighting or sound that add realism to the drama. And then the plot itself, what is the play's sequence of events that move the play and give it structure? Greek tragedy has the following plot structure. You'll have the conflict uh, addressed immediately of here's the characters, here's the conflict they're facing. Then the complication, the events that enhance or alter the conflict. The climax, the most dramatic moment when a sudden turn in fortunes affects the main character. And then the denouement is the end of the drama when the point or moral is revealed. In later drama, not as much, in Greek drama, we get a point or moral revealed. Later in drama, like British Renaissance drama, somewhat, but even not as much today, we don't get necessarily a moral reveal. It's more the wrapping up of the play itself. But a lot of times there's some kind of point or moral revealed, especially in Greek tragedy. So you'll see this with Oedipus. We're presented with immediately here's a king, his town is besieged by plague. What is going on to cause? Then the complication of he tries to find out from the prophets and from the oracles, and they're like, sir, you really don't want to know. Stop looking. And that gives us a complication to the climax of finding out, why his people are experiencing this plague because he killed the previous king and married his mother. And then the denouement, the end, he's learning about how he was blind to what was right in front of him and how the seeking of the truth was not necessarily what was best for his people. And this denouement, like I said, this is self-realization. This is where the main character learns from his or her mistakes. It's a moment of self-realization, completing the psychological, can't see it because of the picture, the psychological action. This is actually something that people are doing research on now of especially Greek tragedy, um, having the ability to be a catharsis for those who witness the play because you go through the drama and the action with the characters, and then that moment of catharsis at the end of that psychological action completion is sometimes helpful for people. This is again showing what the Greek dramatic structure would look like, just like our short story triangle of action. Today, plays are divided into acts, which are major divisions, and scenes, which are episodes within acts. You'll see this especially with Shakespeare. You'll have like Act 1, Scene 2, and Act 1 has like a major division of this is the beginning of the play, and then each scene leading up to what's going on. And then Act 2 might have a major premise of what's going on, and then scenes individual inside the act. But Greek plays were divided into episodes. So you would have the episode, as you'll see with Oedipus, that you have the episode of here's what's going on. Then you get a change in episode marked by strophes and antistrophes, which are choral chanting. So you'll get the during the episode, the main characters are talking to each other about what's going on. And then they'll suddenly go off stage and the chorus will start chanting and talking to the audience to help them process the information that's going on, help them understand the lessons that are trying to be learned, and then we go back to the main episode with the characters. The style refers to how the playwright uses language, including mood and tone. So remember, mood is what you feel reading or watching the play, what the audience is supposed to feel. That's the emotion or attitude conveyed by the play. So is it romantic? Is it tragic, sentimental? The tone is how the playwright approaches it. So is sometimes that can be the same thing. that the tone can be very tragic, which makes you feel tragic. But as we saw with some of the short stories, the tone can be very opposite of what it makes you feel. The realism is the degree to which the play mirrors real life. Is it realistic, fantastic, absurd? So obviously in Oedipus, there's some realistic elements to it, but there's also some fantastic elements. The fact that he's the one who defeated the Sphinx, that, the gods are involved, that there are prophets involved, oracles. Um, with Trifles, it's a very much more realistic because it is based on a real story, but it also doesn't have fantastical elements to it. Whereas Midsummer Night's Dream is a comedy and it has fairies and magic. So it's not just fantastic, but it's a borderline absurd on what could be happening. But it has some realism to it. The speech is going to be the formality of the language as expressed in the dialogue, so how each character speaks versus the vernacular. So if the character is using very formal language, like a lot of Shakespeare's um, noble characters do, same way in Greek plays, the noble characters speak in more formal language. That helps us characterize who they are, but it also tells us, more about the language itself. If the character is using vernacular, that's the language contemporary to a time or rooted in place or culture. So if it was Shakespeare's time, using common slang, common speech in English compared to the formality of the court. If it was in a Greek play being performed, say, in Rome, then it would be, if they're using Greek that's rooted to the place or culture, if they changed and translated it into Latin, then that would be using the vernacular of the people. And then you have obscenities, which are use of words meant to shock or create tension. They're not always curse words. Sometimes it's just any type of word that'll create shock or tension in the play. That is often used not necessarily by noble characters, but the use of it is even by noble characters, just meant to create some kind of shock to the audience of, oh my God, what did he just say? Or create some kind of tension. And just like with short stories and novels, we do have themes, an overriding point or moral of the play. So the origins of drama, what we think in the West of its stage presentation began in ancient Greece from the 5th century BC. There are many other Eastern traditions, especially in Japan, of stage craft, but it's a little bit different than what we do in the West. The origin is evident in common words that we have associated with stage work. The word drama comes from the Greek for doings. Scene comes from the Greek skene or dressing tent. Theater comes from theatron, which is the place to see. And tragedy comes from the Greek for goat song. This was not just oh, we go see a play, but uh, plays were often a part of festivals, but even standalone, they were worshiping Zeus and Dionysus, the god of pleasure, and Zeus is being the king of the gods. So they would offer a goat as sacrifice to the gods to not only bless the play and the actors for a good stage performance, but so that the stage performance would be accepted by the gods as part of a worship for them. Other words from Greek drama, we have prologue from prologos, which is the first part, episode from episodia, which is an incident within a narrative, and even the word thespian, which we talk about for actors, comes from Thespis, who was the first Greek to call individual actors to the forefront. It wasn't about individual actors in the beginning and who they were. It was, no, that's just the person playing Creon. That's just the person playing uh, Tiresias or Oedipus. And it didn't really matter who that person was. But Thespis started actually showing, no, these are individual people. So this is what the ancient Greek theaters would look like. We do have some examples of them as well as some drawings of them. So they were often carved into the hillsides, and you can see very large so that they could accommodate a lot of people. There's also a lot of structures associated with the theater that were outside. You would have in many areas with theaters, there were also little hospitals and mental health retreats and many different things all around the theater that were all associated with the festivals of healing and worshiping the gods and enjoying theater. So these are the parts. You have the orchestra pit, is a circle in the middle. Then you'd have the scene or stage. This is where people would get ready, and a lot of times they would perform in the orchestra pit. The theatron was where people would sit. Parados were the walkways that people would come and go on. You can kind of see that here. But a lot of times the orchestra wasn't just, like the orchestra pit that we think of now if you go to see a modern play. It wasn't just for music. That was also, you know, the front part of the scheme, the dressing tent, and into the orchestra is where the people would go to perform. So there are two types of Greek drama. The comedies were theatrical presentations poking fun at the fallibility of men, veneration of authority, and the omnipotence of the gods. You have ones like Aristophanes' Frogs is a popular comedy. Tragedy is a theatrical presentation in which a calamity befalls someone in authority, usually for purpose of learning some kind of lesson for everybody, not just the person in authority. And these two types, whereas now, we think of comedic relief in tragedy or, tragedy can befall in a comedy, these were very much two delineated subjects. You had no tragedy in comedy, no comedy in tragedy in ancient Greek drama. So in comedy, they would use masks and costumes to exaggerate physical deficiencies, to allow the characters to look as ridiculous as possible. And heroes were often exposed as cowards or fools, leaders as obtuse or greedy, and the whole point was to make fun of human failings. Again, we have several extant works of comedies from Greek drama. Frogs is just the most popular one I can think of, but there are many comedies. There are fewer tragedies that are still existing. The tragedies on stage would draw on well-known myths about gods and heroes. This allowed people to focus more on the lessons about human nature and how people should behave. Because if you already knew how the story was supposed to end, because myth is common to your culture, and you already knew the story of Agamemnon or Oedipus from mythology, you wouldn't be focused on the twists and turns in the story. You would be focused on learning the lesson from it. Actors would wear allegorical masks, fixing expressions of emotion such as anger or fear, or with stereotypical adornment, so like a crown for a king. So that way we know who the characters are supposed to be. And again, it's to teach lessons about human nature and how people should behave. So a great example, Agamemnon, there's a series of plays about him and Clytemnestra and their children, and it details the first democratic court ruling in history. And in the first play, when Agamemnon returns home from the Trojan War, he brings uh, a female prophet, a female oracle who had been cursed, Cassandra, she had been cursed by Apollo because she rejected his advances, that no one would ever believe her prophecies. And Agamemnon brings her home as his concubine. And of course, his wife Clytemnestra is really not happy about that. Your husband's been gone for 10 years, and he brings home another woman and is like, yeah, he's going to join us. And Clytemnestra had been ruling by herself with her own concubines, male concubines. And so she was really upset and she ends up killing Agamemnon. Now, for the people of ancient Greece, that wouldn't be a twist and turn in the story of, oh wow, he's bringing the girl home. Oh my God, we find out Clytemnestra's been cheating on him, and she kills him. You know, things like that would not have been twists and turns. That would have been common knowledge to the people of ancient Greece. So they could focus on what are the lessons that are meant to be learned about how people should behave, about human nature, rather than focusing on plot itself. In tragedy, the main characters are usually members of the privileged class, leaders, chieftains, warriors. A lot of times warriors were leaders, so often go hand in hand. And heroes have both good and bad traits. Most characters are round like that in the fact that they're well developed. The biggest flaw or bad trait that these heroes have is hubris, which is overwhelming pride that makes characters forget their limitations. Obviously, like I said, if you couldn't see it from Agamemnon from my description of him, that his biggest uh, flaw. Oedipus has hubris as well. So there's lots of different hubris going around in tragedy because usually, you know, again, it's to teach lessons about human nature, how people should behave. If people are telling them you should behave this way and you're pretty prideful and you're like, no, I think I'm gonna do what I want, then it's going to change how you view the events of the play. Other characters on stage, you had the chorus, which is meant to be a group of actors who represent the onlookers of the day. They chant to the audience, filling in the background, telling them how to interpret the action. And there's usually more chorus members than there are actual characters. For example, if you look at a modern day play or musical, there is a lot of side characters going on. There's a lot of people, but the ensemble is usually a lot bigger than the major cast. Actors in Greek times were always men. They would wear masks, and important figures wore buskins, which were large elevator shoes that made them appear larger than life. So this is an example of a buskin. It's basically a gladiator type sandal with heels and basically a platform shoe to make them seem taller than everyone else. So that way we would know they're the important figure. In Shakespeare's time, it comes to be more heels, but they're not wearing as much the buskin platform shoe anymore. And actors stay men for a very long time. It's not until after Shakespeare that we start to get women as actors. In the time of the Greeks, it was because, you know, only men were the ones who could worship properly. And, you know, same way only men could participate in the Olympics. And when we get to Shakespeare's time, theater is not considered an honorable profession, so men doing it is bad enough that they wouldn't want women doing it too. And as I said, the role of myth in these stories is that playwrights use references to shared mythology because it controls the audience's reaction. If not everyone who sees the play is surprised, then they can focus more on the lesson than plot turns and twists. And a homogeneous audience share the same religious and cultural values. So all the Greeks would know the same mythology, and they were usually all the same ones attending the play. If you had foreigners come in, it's a little bit different. They'd have different religious and cultural values, so they might not understand the mythology. There's also a thing called unity in Greek drama, and specifically three unities. So the three individual ones are unity of place, time, and action, and Greek drama has unity in all three. So when you have unity of place, it means the action is in one location. You'll notice with trifles, the action takes place in one location, one time, one conflict. There's some unity still in modern plays, but a lot of times we get multiple locations or not just a single day of action. There's a unity of time, which is that single day of action, continuous time flow, and unity of action, one conflict or problem affecting the protagonist, no subplots. So even Midsummer Night's Dream, it takes place over course of 24 hours, but the action is not in one location, and there are multiple subplots in addition to the main plot of the lovers. So you can see that sometimes we can have unity of one or the other, but in Greek drama, we have unity of all three. So for the action in Greek drama, there was little on-stage action. It was mostly talking when people were on stage. When action does occur, fights, wars, murders, it'll happen off stage. Sometimes in ancient plays, offstage action would be represented by a rolling cart in which iconic figures passed over the stage, showing that they had died or something had happened to them. Even when you get to the part of Oedipus, when he takes out his eyes at the end of the play and Jocasta kills herself, that would not be shown on the stage. Now, a lot of this um, is because they believed that talking about it or what had happened was enough, that you didn't need to see the violence in order to understand what had happened. And for many of the people watching, in ancient Greek times, you had 100% participation in military. So, and there were a lot of wars written that occurred during the times these were written, the tragedies. So, not that PTSD is anything new. It is something that has affected humans for ages. It's just something we have a word to put to it now. But a lot of these soldiers coming back from war to, worship at these tragedy festivals, they wouldn't have needed to see this action either. Most of them could picture it themselves. A messenger or eyewitness would explain any offstage action to the characters on stage, so that way you knew what happened. And then Greek dramatists aimed for psychological action. It was not about physical action as much as transformations that affected the character's emotions, motivations, and beliefs. It's not so much about the violence at the end of Oedipus that is important as much as him learning his lesson. And drama has evolved since ancient Greece, but the basic structure of drama remains the same, based as it is on chronology of events. But as drama evolves, the gods play less of a role. So humans become more responsible for their own actions and outcomes. You'll see with Oedipus that a big deal is fate and fighting against fate. And we'll talk about that when we get to the Oedipus PowerPoint in a separate video. But fate, as dictated by the gods, is usually the most important. Or even if you think of the Odyssey, the minute Odysseus goes against the gods is when his problems begin. Um, but as we start to go down the line, it's less blaming everything that happens to us on the gods and more, no, humans are responsible for what happens. All right. And this next part, we're just going to go over some of the differences with English Renaissance drama, which is Shakespeare and his influences. So you can see kind of some of the differences from ancient Greek plays. So these are some of the influences on English drama of the Elizabethan age. The Elizabethan age is from the 1500s to the early 1600s when Queen Elizabeth I reigned over England. So you had traditions and conventions of ancient Greek and Roman theater. This is very much during the English Renaissance, where they're reviving Greek and Roman writings and traditions and kind of reviving them. But they also have, at this point during the medieval time period, there were stories and religious dramas. You would have the moral plays where a character called Every Man, who was meant to represent every person, would learn some kind of moral. You would have the mystery plays, and the miracle plays, which would uh, depict stories from the Bible. So these medieval religious dramas were their structure, their stories were going to be an influence on English drama as much as the revival of ancient Greek and Roman theater. Facts and legends of British and European history. We have at this time period during Queen Elizabeth I, the Protestant Reformation going on, especially started by her father. There's a lot of upheaval. We'll get into that. But also contemporary Elizabethan politics. Um, Even the fact of, the idea of British history in general. We're getting stories, more updated versions of the Kings of England. We have recent history. The War of the Roses was before Elizabeth's father's time, and it established the Tudor line. You have European history in general, like the Dutch with stories of Hamlet. Um, a lot of that, people are gonna, the playwrights were going to be more drawn to their own history than to ancient Greek and Roman history because there's some national pride to it. There are some similarities. Comedy and tragedy still have divisions, um, that you would go to see a comedy or a tragedy. Not that their divisions are so strict as with Greek drama, because thinking about Romeo and Juliet, you have Mercutio makes jokes all throughout, even though it's a tragedy, he's making jokes. There are some funny parts to Romeo and Juliet. There's some tragedy to some of the comedies, tragic befallings upon the characters that end up eventually working their way out to lead to comedy. Characters are often of noble birth, kings, members of the court. It'll feature a protagonist, antagonist, and foil. Stories are still based on myths, legends, and history that are well known to the audience. And the tragic hero usually has a fatal flaw. Um, in Renaissance drama, some of the best ones, Hamlet is one of the best examples that he's got hubris. So does especially Othello has a lot of hubris. So they do have a fatal flaw. Some differences between Greek and Renaissance drama, the first being that the structure adds exposition before the conflict is introduced. So instead of just, here's a conflict, they'll start with, no, here's how the characters are related to each other. And exposition just means that it tells us what happened before the play opens, how the characters are related, and any other background needed to prepare us for the conflict. Especially if bigger audiences, less homogenized audiences at this point going to see the play. So not everyone would know the story as well. So it's better to explain how the characters are related to each other rather than just assuming the audience knows. Most action also occurs on stage. Fights, suicides, murders, they're witnessed, they're not just reported. Obviously, it's nothing near the violent and bloodiness that we see in movies today, but it is still witnessed. When Romeo kills himself over Juliet, you see him take the poison. When Juliet stabs herself, you see her stab herself with a stage knife. We do actually witness the action. Costumes, set, props, and special effects are still used, but instead of using masks and buskins, they're just using normal day-to-day costumes. And now we have set rather than just a background like a concert would be. We get sets, we get better props, more special effects as technology has evolved. And the tragic hero, although they have a fatal flaw, they don't have that moment of realization. Only the audience and other characters understand how the hero's flaw led to their tragedy. So, for example, in Othello, we recognize that he was tricked by Iago. We recognize that it was his self-doubt and his pride that led to his downfall and led to him being tricked by Iago. But he doesn't ever have that moment of realization himself. It also starts to borrow from Roman revenge tragedy theme, in which the protagonist must avenge the unfair death or treatment of a relative. So obviously the Greeks didn't have this as much because the Romans were after their time, but we do get this revenge tragedy theme. And it's not always just death. Obviously, that's very much a Hamlet thing. Um, Also very much a Macbeth thing. But we also get the revenge tragedy in lesser extent in other plays. For example, Much Ado About Nothing, when a hero's honor is ruined by a rumor and her family rallies around her and wants revenge. They don't want someone dead, but they do want revenge and for her hero's honor to be restored. Also, God and the gods, though they're mentioned, they're secondary to the state because state and church are one at this point, which is the Church of England. And Renaissance England was rent by internal feuds and threats to the leadership of Queen Elizabeth I, so plays were reinforcing the supremacy of the English throne. At this time period, we have the Protestant Reformation. In England, it started because King Henry VIII was married to not Anne. He wanted to marry Anne Boleyn because his first wife was unable to produce a son. His first wife was also the wife of his brother before his brother passed. And even though she claimed they never got the chance to consummate their marriage, there were lots of ideas that, well, because maybe they had consummated the marriage, maybe it was against God, that Henry had taken his brother's widow as his wife. Maybe that's why he wasn't having a son. Um, and he wanted a divorce. And of course, Catholic Church said, no, absolutely not. You already have a child with her. You're not getting a divorce. This is ridiculous. And they wouldn't grant him an annulment either because he already had a child with her, Queen Mary, later Queen Mary. And so he decided to pressure Parliament into giving him the power to start the Church of England, and that he would rule the Church of England as well as rule over Parliament. And so you have questioning by the people of if the divine right of kings is given to them by God, but now God also talks to the king, and questions of, well, if God is supposed to talk to the Pope, but now it talks to the king. Like, what is meant to be? And so there's questions and threats to the leadership, not as much to Henry because he is a male, but with Elizabeth, it was the first time they'd had a queen who ruled without a king by her side, who ruled truly by herself. So you also had the uh, misogyny added to it that people felt that a queen could not rule by herself. She needed a king by her side. So those threats plus the idea of questioning of religion of the Church of England and the problems leading up to Elizabeth taking the throne with the line of succession, that all meant that there was a lot of political difficulties, so plays would reinforce the supremacy of the English throne. There was also a frequent use of the supernatural. We get ghosts in Hamlet, witches in Macbeth, fairies in Midsummer Night's Dream. So we get a lot of different supernatural creatures. Again, playing to some of the supernatural mythology of England, but also how else are you going to have some things out of the character's control and not have it be the gods or God? There's no unity of time, place, and action. Again, as we saw with Midsummer Night's Dream, there might be unity of time, but not really much of place or action. Events are going to take place in a variety of settings over a longer period of time. Subplots are frequently featured, so much so that some of them are overlooked sometimes. There is a subplot in Hamlet where he gets kidnapped by pirates, and most people just overlook that and go right into the rest of the play, but it's actually a pretty interesting subplot. Tragedies also feature comic relief, so the tragic mood is going to be occasionally lifted to provide the audience some moments of humor. We especially get this in the Henry IV plays with the character of Falstaff. He's very much a comedic relief character. And again, the purpose of the plays now is not just to teach some kind of lesson or poke fun at people, but to reinforce the Elizabethan political system and to entertain the masses. So frequently, these plays feature sexually suggestive, scatological references, all kinds of different things, and sometimes we miss them because language meant different things at different time periods. The best example, Much Ado About Nothing. The play title to us is, well, you know, it's a big hullabaloo about nothing happening. And that was its meaning back then too. But nothing the word nothing was also used as slang for female genitals. So Much Ado About a Woman Having Sex basically was a common understanding of that title of the play. So we often miss these sexually suggestive scatological references. So a lot of things that I like to mention with students is that Shakespeare is not pretentious. Shakespeare wrote to the masses. Yes, he wrote for higher audiences as well, but mostly to entertain the masses. It's sometimes that we overblow his character that can make the people who study him potentially pretentious. So try to approach Shakespeare as best you can. Some of the essentials about Shakespeare himself, there were many other playwrights during Shakespeare's time. We're just focusing on Shakespeare because we don't have time to focus on them all. But Ben Jonson was a contemporary of Shakespeare who wrote plays. There are many, many others that if you ever get the chance to study them, I encourage it because their plays are just as good as Shakespeare's. He was born April 26, 1564, in Stratford upon Avon, which is also where he died, April 23rd, 1616. Now, the date of April 26th, we don't know that it was April 26th for sure. Um, we know he was registered 1564 and that he was baptized. So we assume late April. So usually his birthday and death day are celebrated on April 23rd because we know that date for certain. He's also called the Bard of Avon, and he's considered the greatest English language dramatist of all time. Part of that is because of the extensiveness of his repertoire of plays, but also because he created all kinds of different words and phrases for language. Now, his plays were written in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. They're now performed and read more often and in more countries than those of any other dramatist. But we don't know a lot about Shakespeare's personal life. We know that his father was potentially a Catholic who was in hiding, but he also worked for the town. So we know that as a man who worked for the town of Stratford upon Avon, he would have gotten William would have gotten a education as befitted a town employee child, but we have no proof of him going to any school. Um, also don't have any of the manuscripts. There's nothing written in Shakespeare's own hand. Like we have the manuscripts of Jane Austen, we have her diaries and journals talking about writing her stories. We don't have any of that for Shakespeare. We only have some notes on the plays that other people took while they were being performed. And we have the playbills, and then we get the first folio published in 1623 after he's died. And that was his friends collecting all of the plays and putting them together to be published so that people could read them. So because of that, many scholars doubt whether he was actually the writer of the plays. Even, and this isn't something, just now. This is something that even after his death, people doubted whether he wrote all of the plays. Mark Twain is one of the most famous doubters of Shakespeare being Shakespeare. And some people believe that a nobleman borrowed Shakespeare's name and attached it to his own works and paid Shakespeare to participate in the cover-up. That's kind of basically the basic premise of the plot of the movie Anonymous, is that it was someone else. Some people believe with as much writing as Queen Elizabeth did, it was okay for her to do poetry as a woman and as a queen, but it would not have been okay for her to do plays. So it's possible that she wrote the plays and Shakespeare put his name on it for her. He was often her favorite playwright, so that's where that leads some questioning. But we also know that whether he had a true education or not, he was friends with a lot of people in high places, including a nobleman who allowed him use of the library at his estate. And that nobleman is one that has been suggested if Shakespeare were bisexual that would be his bisexual lover. Um, so there are a lot of ideas about who actually wrote Shakespeare. And since we don't have the manuscript, we don't know the truth, but they're most attributed to Shakespeare. We also know that a lot of times playwrights would collaborate with each other, just like writers collaborate with each other today. But the difference is that the person who did the most work was the one who was attributed to the play. So there, scholars have found parts of Shakespeare's plays that do not sound like they're in his voice. They sound like the voice of other actors at the time, and they've found Shakespeare's voice in other actors, other not actors, other playwrights works. So they all worked with each other. It's also possible that he wrote them but couldn't write and had a scribe write them. There are many, many different options. So during Shakespeare's time, ideas and social structures that were established in the Middle Ages still informed human thought and behavior. People believed that Queen Elizabeth I was God's deputy on earth, and everyone else had their due places in society under her. And noblemen believed they had responsibilities up through her to God and down to those of more humble rank. Again, there were a lot of threats to the Elizabethan social system politics. Um, Partially because of the line of succession after King Henry VIII died, because when he divorced his first wife, he basically illegitimized his relationship to Mary, that she was now an illegitimate child. When Anne Boleyn, Queen Elizabeth's mother, was beheaded, he too, uh, it made her an illegitimate child. And then his wife, Jane Seymour, the third wife, gave birth to um, the King Edward, or Prince Edward, who did survive into adulthood, did survive long enough to become king, but he was a very sickly, weak child, and he was the only son of Henry. So when he died, there he had no children of his own. It automatically went to his eldest sister, Queen Mary, who was staunchly Catholic, because and of course felt robbed by what her father had done to her mother. So Mary tried to bring the entirety of England back under Catholic rule, and it was very violent because anyone who supported the Protestant, church was often tortured or killed if they wouldn't switch back to Catholicism. And then after Queen Mary died, again childless, Queen Elizabeth takes over and she was staunchly Protestant, and she brings it back, and she tried to be less violent than her sister because she knew that the society needed to heal and they needed to trust each other, but there were still problems between Catholics and Protestants, and especially the fact that many people supported Queen Mary of Scots right to the throne. So there was the uprising that tried to put Queen Mary of Scots on the throne of England, and that was knocked down during Elizabeth's time. There were also other noblemen who tried to fight against her. Again, a lot of that is all because of King Henry, and the rebuke of the Pope's divine authority fueled questions about the whole concept of kings and queens as God's representatives on earth. But other things were happening at the same time. We have French and Italian philosophers, including Montaigne, Machiavelli. They're analyzing political systems and behavior. They're viewing monarchs as human beings inspired by human desires rather than representatives of God's will, especially Machiavelli's The Prince, and what kind of society, how rulers should be. Machiavelli believed rulers should be cruel and heartless and just rule by force, whereas other people said no, they're human, they should start to act like humans. Also, because of the printing press and greater education starting, more people were able to read these works because mass production, and it led them to question the political system, which also led to other challenges to authority. In 1605, just after Elizabeth has passed, her cousin James I of England, James VI of Scotland, Queen Mary of Scots' son, takes over as King of England, and he is not popular because he is willing to stick to Protestantism, even though his mother was Catholic. And um, the English Catholics were very upset that he didn't switch things back to Catholicism. And led by Guy Fawkes, they had the Gunpowder Plot of 1605. They were going to blow up Parliament with the king inside. And it, thankfully for them, failed. Not so thankfully for Guy Fawkes. But him and the other conspirators were caught before they could set off the bomb. And that's where we get Guy Fawkes Day. Is from the Gunpowder Plot of 1605 that V for Vendetta is also based upon. So we have a lot of questioning at this time period. We also get the English language changing. As we said with poetry section, at this time period we can have early modern English, but now because we have cheaper printed books that are more available to everybody, the language is also becoming standardized in grammar and vocabulary more slowly in spelling, but we're starting to have dictionaries and apply grammar rules so that it's more standardized across for everyone. And this allowed more people to read, which gave authors more power to influence public thought than they had in the past. Now, Elizabethan theater is borrowed from the Romans, where they had circular instead of a half circle with a stage, kind of like what we do in the West now. They were large walled theaters. Um, this is some drawings of the Globe Theater on the left. The Globe Theater, interestingly, was not the first theater that the King's Chambermen or the Queen's Men, they just changed their name after King came in. Shakespeare's people originally had one theater, but they didn't own the land. And when the landowner was going to raise the rent, they decided they were going to demolish their theater, move it across the river to land they did own, and build their theater there. And they built the Globe Theater. Now, unfortunately, the Globe burned in 1666 as during the Great Fire of London. It also had previously burned and was rebuilt. The one we have now in modern times on the River Thames is not the globe that Shakespeare and his men performed in, but it is an accurate reconstruction based on the drawings of the Globe Theater. So as you can see, based on the drawings, it was circular and walled. You still had the stage towards one end, but you had kind of three-quarter around where people could see, very much again like modern theaters would be. Some influences on Shakespeare's plays they mostly would draw from literature of the past. So Raphael Holinshed's Chronicles from 1587 included the stories on which Shakespeare based King Lear and Macbeth. You had Italy's Commedia dell'arte, which was a style of comic theater that included clowns, pantomime, and improvisation, and it influenced the style of comedies such as The Taming of the Shrew. Also, the idea of a clown type character influenced even characters like Falstaff in the non-comedies. The Roman poets Ovid and Seneca influenced the speeches in Shakespeare's Roman plays, such as Julius Caesar and Titus Andronicus. The Et tu, Brute that we all know from Julius Caesar being stabbed and accusing his nephew Brutus of joining in with them, like, and you too, Brutus. That's purely Shakespeare. We don't know that Caesar ever actually said that when he was stabbed. The Greek tragedies of Sophocles and Aeschylus, with their flawed heroes and use of messengers and servants to deliver news and advance the plot, are definitely, we can see especially, the messenger who brings to Romeo the tragedy that Juliet has died, helps him return to uh, uh, Verona. And so there's that. Saxo Grammaticus's 12th century Gesta Danorum tells the story of the Danish prince Hamlet. That was a big influence. British history itself, especially with his history plays. And a lot of Shakespeare's fame rests on his use of language not necessarily his stories. Yes, we know his stories very well. They've been replayed. There are so many different versions of Romeo and Juliet. Hamlet was, made into a basis storyline for The Lion King. There are many, many, many stories and their influences today, but a lot of it is the language. He's created over 800 words and phrases. Things like good riddance, come what may, the game is up, wear your heart on your sleeve, out of the jaws of death, too much of a good thing, break the ice, a wild goose chase, love is blind. These are all phrases and words that we have been able to attribute to Shakespeare's plays. So understanding Shakespeare's language, like Shakespeare's other plays, Hamlet is written in a combination of verse, poetry, and prose or everyday language. Um, Midsummer Night's Dream and the comedies are not as much, but the royal characters will still speak an unrhymed iambic pentameter called blank verse. And an iamb is an unaccented syllable followed by an accented one. Penta means five, so it means there are 5 beats per line, and meter refers to a regular rhythmic pattern. So each foot is basically 2 iambs, and so there are 10 syllables, 10 iambs, or 5 iambs, 10 syllables per line. So again, 5 iambs per line, 10 syllables. It's the most common rhythm in English poetry. It sounds like 5 heartbeats. Um, Usually we hear this more with the emphasis of words. So yet so far hath expression fought with nature that we with wisest sorrow think on him. You can see where the emphasis is placed is going to be, this is the unaccented, this is the accented syllable. Non-royal characters will use everyday speech patterns. So when reading Shakespeare aloud, read it like any contemporary text. Don't stop at the end of each line. Let the punctuation guide your pauses. Oh, that this too solid flesh would melt, thaw, and resolve itself into a dew, or that the everlasting had not fixed his cannon against self-slaughter. There are also translations online if you're not sure, if you're having troubles reading a scene or a section of a scene and you're just not sure what they're saying and what it makes sense. You can find translations into modern English from early modern. There's also, if you're curious about how it would have been pronounced, obviously we're pronouncing it with modern day English, but pronunciations were a little bit different then. There are some videos on YouTube that you can find of how Shakespeare would have been pronounced. All right, so that is English drama and Greek drama, and in the next few videos, we'll go over the specific plays of Oedipus, Rex, Trifles, and then Midsummer Night's Dream.